Hey guys, Josh here in the Cast Strength Whiskey Conservatory, deep in the bowels of the earth below Austin, Texas. It's a cornucopia of distilled delights, and we have one such beautiful specimen for you here today, the Glenmorangie Allta. So Glenmorangie Allta is number 10 in their private edition series, which is something they do every year. They take the base Glenmorangie spirit and do different creative things with it that fall outside of the core range. Previous releases, like the last one was Spios, was aged in ex-American rye whiskey casks. They've had other releases using different types of barley, things like that. And this particular one, Allta, was cultivated with wild yeast that the master distiller and blender of Glenmorangie, Dr. Bill Lumsden, cultivated from barley fields nearby the distillery. So it's their own wild yeast that they found in their environment, and they decided, let's give this a try, see what sort of different flavors and characteristics that using a atypical yeast would impart to our spirit. And Allta is Scottish Gaelic for wild. So the presentation on Allta, it's 51.2%, so pretty high proof in there. It's not chill filtered, natural color. It was matured exclusively in ex-bourbon casks, both first fill and refill bourbon casks. And I thought that was an interesting thing to do with this whiskey. I think that a lot of distillers, especially from what I've heard about Scotch whiskey distillers, is that the influence of the yeast strain really isn't considered that often by a lot of folks, and it's more about what type of yeast is going to produce the most yield, how much alcohol can the yeast produce, and that's everything else really contributes to the flavor and the texture and everything in the whiskey. So I thought it was really creative of Glenmorangie to cultivate their own yeast strain from their environment and see what effect that would have on the whiskey. So I think it's significantly different from the core Glenmorangie original, even though it is a higher proof and everything like that, but I think it takes on an entirely different flavor characteristic. So right away, I mean, it's got that similar pale yellow gold color that you get in the Glenmorangie original, but it's got a little bit more of an amber to it. And it certainly jumps out of the glass a little bit more than the original does. It's probably due to the higher proof, but also there's just an additional complexity there. Now, I don't know, could be a little bit of the power of suggestion. I mean, they got the yeast thing going on in the marketing angles that they're putting out for this whiskey, but I feel like there's absolutely yeasty, bready, kind of pastry type notes going on in here. You still get that base spirit of Glenmorangie, that fruity, kind of bright, herbal, honeyed character that it has in the Glenmorangie original. But this sort of rounds those off and adds sort of a French pastry richness to it. It reminds me of that. So, especially on the nose, it's like a iced honey bun with a bit of like lemon curd in there. I don't know. It's really quite rich and fruity and sweet, but also has those yeasty esters, those bread type notes. You can absolutely tell the higher proof there, but it's not aggressive. It's actually rather light still, despite being over 100 proof. The length on the palate is really nice as well. It still continues to linger and linger. You get all this rich sweetness up front, and these round pastry type notes that I was describing come in there. But then as it goes towards the finish, you get a little bit more of a citrusy, almost green apple type bite to it. That's just really fantastic. Now, I went to a launch event for this whiskey recently, where I had the pleasure of getting to meet Dr. Bill Lumsden and listen to him talk, not only about this whiskey, but about a bunch of others in the Glenmorangie range, and did a bunch of question and answer stuff, which was very, very cool. And he described that effect himself about the power of suggestion, if he's thinking about wild yeast and what they contribute to the fermentation and such, as even he who created this whiskey is drinking it, does that suggest to him yeasty, bready type notes, and is that where he's getting it from? Which I found was really interesting, that even the guy that designed this whiskey and came up with the idea is still being very aware that he's subject to being influenced by suggestion. Wow, it's just wonderful. Glorious stuff. I've become a really big fan of Glenmorangie recently. Actually, I think they do a fantastic job. I think they always have an eye towards not only consistency and quality, but they're also clearly open to experimentation and doing interesting stuff. There's a lot of science behind what they do, and also a lot of passion behind what they do. So if you see it around, it'll only be around for a limited time. I would absolutely recommend picking one up. You can see I've already shared this guy a couple of times. Everybody's really seemed to enjoy it. So I would give this, it could have maybe a little more complexity going on in there, I suppose, but it's really hard to find fault with it. I think it would be interesting to see this with a little bit of maybe a smoke character, or maybe some sort of cask finish going along with it as well, instead of just the all bourbon maturation. I think they could take this same concept of the wild yeast and continue to use it, but in different ways, and see how that turns out. I think that would be really interesting, and probably produce some fantastic whiskey along the way. The Glenmorangie Allta, I don't know if I'm going to continue to use the Vito scale, or maybe we should use the Brad scale. We could go from not good to kind of good to pretty good to really good to like really, really good. Or I could just go with the boring old 8.5 out of 10.